I'm Dr. Stu Hoffman, President of ChiroSecure, and welcome to another ChiroSecure Special Report. I have the privilege of introducing our special guest today. Do you know how you determine who the really greats in this profession are? These are the people that everyone calls upon when they need something to help them solve a problem, provide some clarity, and put some perspective on important matters, and no one is called more upon in this day and age than my good friend and mentor, Dr. Gerard Clum. Today, Dr. Clum is going to put some perspective on the tragic death of Katie May, known as the Queen of Snapchat. Interestingly enough, over the last week, you have probably been inundated with emails from the national associations, your state associations, regarding how to respond to the public's inquiries about Katie May's stroke issue, which has been all over the news media and social media ever since the coroner's report was released last week. Although your awareness of this may be recent, both Dr. Clum and myself have been intensely involved in this since the past February when Miss May first died. In fact, in April or May of this year, we were both interviewed regarding this circumstance by Sean Hamill of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and that article is now available. You may be aware that just October 20th of this year, Dr. Clum and I did a previous special report on this issue, and if you weren't one of the 4,000 plus viewers of that video, it is still available on our ChiroSecure Facebook page. A lot has transpired though since October 20th, and I asked Dr. Clum to join ChiroSecure and again update us on what is happening at this point in time. Dr. Clum said something when we started the last special report that I consider the best piece of advice that you can hear on this matter. And that was, hey, let's all take a deep breath. I think it is important that in all such matters, that should always be the first thing that we do. So with the utmost respect, I just want to introduce to you Dr. Gerard Clum.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to the next few minutes that we can share the most current and up-to-date information regarding the Katie May situation with our friends and colleagues. As Dr. Hoffman noted in the introduction, the passing of Miss Katie May was a tragic event. It's an important event in the history of the profession, one that we need to learn from, one that we need to understand completely, and one that we need to put in perspective as a profession and as individual practitioners. We begin this discussion by offering our greatest and deepest sympathies to the family of Katie May and to her friends on her untimely passing. Next slide, please. Over the course of the next few minutes, we're going to look at 6 different sets of information. First, we're going to look at what's been reported in the press. Then we'll move on to what we think we know about the situation at this point. The third area we'll be looking at what's to be learned yet in this case. The fourth is to evaluate how the details of this case as we understand them square with the evidence that's been published to date. The fifth, we'll begin to talk about what we can learn from this experience. And the sixth is, depending upon your circumstances in your practice, we'll just discuss a little bit about what you can do differently as a result of the information brought forward in this case. Next slide, please. So let's begin with a discussion about what's been reported in this matter. For those of you that have followed this scenario since its earliest days in January and February of this year, you'll know that there were early reports that Ms. May had fallen during a photo shoot and had a rather severe injury to her neck. Well, in the fullness of time, we understand that this was not the case. There was not a fall, but there was a photo shoot, and during the photo shoot, she was requested to hold a pose for an extended period of time that caused her to be in a position with her back arched and her neck turned to the side for an extended period of time. Immediately after this activity of this pose, she experienced neck pain. And she went on to report in social media that she thought she had a, quote, pinched nerve, unquote, following the photo shoot. Next slide, please. It was also reported in the popular press in February and in March of this year that Ms. May sought care from an emergency room for the neck pain and discomfort she experienced during the photo shoot. We now know that this was not the case. To the best of our knowledge and understanding, Ms. May did not attend to an emergency room in January or February of this year for this neck pain. We do know that she attended to a chiropractor on January 27th, 29th, and February 1st, and we're not sure if she attended to any other providers along the way. She may have, but there's no evidence to suggest she has at this point, but it's not clear as to whether or not that has been completely ruled out. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most important or the most thorough discussion of this in the popular press was published on October 23rd by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And in that presentation, the reporter made reference to the fact that Ms. May experienced a high velocity, low amplitude adjustment, a low velocity, low amplitude manipulation, and she had mechanical traction when she visited the chiropractor in late January and early February of this year. Now, we don't know anything more about what that means in the opinion of the reporter. We don't know if he knows what high velocity, low amplitude adjustments are versus low amplitude, and we certainly don't know what mechanical traction means. So we're really in the dark about what was done by the chiropractor during those days. The gentleman also reported in the Post-Gazette that 8 hours after she was seen by the chiropractor on February 1st, that she began to feel progressively worse, that she developed dizziness and headache, numbness, and eventually slurred speech. Subsequently, she presented to Cedars-Sinai emergency room in Los Angeles. She was recognized very soon and very quickly as being in the process of a stroke, and TPA was administered in the hospital. TPA, as you recall, is what people know as the clot-busting drug, in hopes that the medication could dissolve the clot and prevent brain damage. She was diagnosed as having bilateral vertebral artery dissections. Next slide, please. In the fullness of time, we know that the TPA didn't work, that the clot-busting drug did not have the effect that it was hoped to have. And today, we're now dealing with the next phase of this process as it unfolds, with the release of the coroner's report from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office on the death of Ms. May. We're again at a significant disadvantage because, to our knowledge, no one in the profession has had a chance to review the coroner's report, and we are reacting to what has appeared in the press, so on. The article that I made reference to before from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette quotes the coroner's report as saying the primary cause of death was infarction of the brain, and that a secondary cause of death was vertebral artery dissection. In response to the question of how the injury occurred, the coroner reported, quote, neck manipulation by chiropractor, close quote. Also in this same report from the Post-Gazette, it was reported that Ms. May experienced bilateral vertebral artery dissections, with the left being more severely dissected than the right, but the right dissection being more recent than the left. And as we know, Ms. May succumbed to the effects of the infarct on February 4th, 2016. Next slide, please. So what's yet to be learned about this case from our perspective as chiropractors and as individuals concerned about the care that we provide and the response to our patients? First and foremost, we do not know at this point how Ms. May presented for care on January 27th. We don't know what symptoms she presented with. We don't know how they changed over the ensuing days. We don't know what was done by the chiropractor to assess Ms. May when she did present for care. And as a result, we're at a very significant disadvantage to understanding this fully in relationship to the chiropractic interface, because we know so little about how she presented, what she presented with, and what was done to her on assessment. Next slide. We also don't know what care was provided to Ms. May. We understand what the reporters wrote on October 23rd of high velocity, low amplitude, low amplitude, and mechanical traction, but we really don't know what that means. We don't know what type of adjustments, we don't know what type of traction procedures and so on, and we don't know how she responded to care each day as she went through this sequence of 3 visits. We don't know if she presented with any signs or symptoms that the chiropractor should have responded to or failed to. This could have been a very straightforward presentation as mechanical neck pain, no signs of neurological complications, no signs of anything else to be concerned about, but we know obviously that those developed over time. But at that initial presentation, there may have been things there to respond to that the chiropractor didn't look at. And quite honestly, there could have been nothing that would have triggered the person to think that this is a more complicated circumstance. We also don't know if the chiropractor involved made any recommendations to Ms. May about what she should do in response to her circumstances, in terms of should she seek a referral from a neurologist, should she consult an emergency room, so on. The record is just simply silent in this, or I shouldn't say the record. The information set is silent at this point. And then also, we don't know if Ms. May was offered an informed consent to care prior to the time that she received chiropractic care, and if she was offered an informed consent, if that detailed any association between vertebral artery dissection and chiropractic care. Next slide, please. As we noted before, we have not had a chance to see the coroner's report. We don't know the detail beyond what was reported by the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, but we do know one thing that did come out from the coroner himself, where he was quoted in the press as saying he has never seen a case of this type in his career. Now, I certainly don't mean to impugn the integrity or the competency of the coroner in any way. I'm sure the gentleman is qualified and quite competent. But it's also a reality that he sees various causes of death very commonly and repeatedly over time. For this to be the first time that he saw something of this nature in his career means it's very unique, and we know that. We know how rare this condition is. And it also causes us to bring into question as to whether or not the coroner, with all due respect, had an appreciation for the nuanced nature of this problem and was aware of the literature associated with it. If it was a quick search and review of case studies that have talked about this, the conclusion could be drawn one way. If the person went to the depth of the literature, looked at the key pieces of literature that we'll talk about in just a moment, it may have come to a different conclusion. We don't know what the thought processes were. We don't know how extensive that evaluation was on the coroner's part. And we're left with the comment, again, that he's never seen one of these in his career. Obviously, very rare. Next slide, please. Now, one very important thing relative to how does this square with the evidence that's been published to date, this case appears to fit the scenario of a dissection in progress perfectly. That is, that the neck pain the patient presented with on January 27th was a sign of the dissection underway. Now, historically, we know that 20 years ago, the discussion was patient presents to a chiropractor, patient gets adjusted, patient develops a dissection, dissection develops into an embolism develops into a stroke, etc. The chiropractor caused it. That's the old thinking. The current thinking is, in the majority of these cases, that the patient dissects, the dissection produces neck pain and headache, the patient seeks care for the neck pain and headache, and they go on to have emboli and stroke at essentially the same rate, whether they attend to a chiropractor or to a medical doctor. And this is a very critical understanding for us to really fully appreciate in this discussion. The literature that was generated by David Cassidy in 2008 compared the population of persons in the province of Ontario over a 9-year period with generating almost 110 million person years of data regarding this process of arterial dissection. And what Cassidy found was that people, when they dissect, they seek care for the pain, and whether they seek care from a chiropractor or they seek care from a medical doctor, they go on to stroke at essentially the same rate. Now, this is a very important element because I think it's logical for us to assume that the medical doctors involved are not providing cervical adjustments, and the chiropractors involved in the care are providing cervical adjustments. And if there is no increase in risk, and that the basic background risk associated with medical care is not exceeded by the patients under chiropractic care, then it's logical to conclude that what the chiropractor is doing in his or her office is not contributing to this problem. That's the takeaway of Cassidy. Now, the question that remains before us at this point is, did the chiropractor fail to recognize an evolving dissection? As I said a few moments ago, this may have presented in a very benign manner that there was no sign of any possible dissection other than neck pain. Now, you see patients with neck pain day in and day out, and thankfully, the infinite majority of them, the overwhelming majority of them, have nothing to do with the dissection, and it's mechanical neck pain. But there are some signs, and we'll talk about those in just a minute, that you might want to pay a little bit more, not might want to, you should pay a little bit more attention to if you see them in your office. The second question is, did the care of the chiropractor worsen the evolving dissection that the patient presented with? If we now know in retrospect that the pose that was held by Ms. May on January 27th that resulted in the neck pain began the dissection, was the care of the chiropractor involved in worsening this dissection, or did this evolve as it was going to evolve regardless of whether or not a chiropractor was involved? Next slide, please. Now, in terms of, again, how does this circumstance of Ms. May square with the evidence that's been published to date? Well, she does fall into that age group of persons under 45 years of age. And we know from Cassidy, and we know from Kozloff and Elton and other studies, that persons under the age of 45 have a little bit higher incidence of dissection than persons over age 45. So we know that she was in that age group. We also know, obviously, that she was female, and we know that there's a little bit higher incidence among the females of the population than the males for this process of arterial dissection. We don't know, but she may have been on birth control. She was certainly within an age group that persons in their mid-30s, females in their mid-30s, would typically be using birth control. She may have a family history of aneurysm or vessel disorders. We don't know that, but it's a possibility. And she may have had an undiagnosed collagen disorder, increasing her predisposition for dissection. Each one of these circumstances, if they existed, increased the predisposition likelihood that that pose she held contributed to the dissection itself and to the complication of the dissection over time. The most important for us as chiropractors looking at this unanswerable question in this matter is very simply, had Ms. May never sought care from a chiropractor, had she gone to Starbucks instead of the chiropractor, had she gone to a medical doctor or the movies, would she have had the same fate in the final analysis? We don't know that. Obviously, it is more comforting for us to think, yes, she would have. But we need to be honest and we need to be candid in evaluating that and try and learn as much as we can about this situation as we move forward. Next slide, please. Now, what can we learn from this experience? Well, first and foremost, as much as we see neck pain day in and day out, and it becomes a normal routine for us, we need to continue to be alert to the possibility of dissection in progress. Dissection in progress, the most common symptom presentation of a dissection in progress is the presentation of neck pain and headache. And we want to look for neck pain and headache that has an unusual origin or an unusual character to it. When this presents, you want to explore the symptoms of neck pain and headache with those patients during your assessment as fully as possible. You want to learn as much as possible about the type of pain they're having, the presentation of the pain, the history of it, how long it's been around, where it came from, how it started. You want to look for unique characteristics in terms of the pain and its intensity. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that's also important for us to learn from this experience is the social value, the clinical value, and the legal value of informed consent documentation. Now, you can make the argument very clearly, and I could probably help you make the argument, that if there is no greater risk for vertebral artery dissection under chiropractic care in comparison to medical care for persons with neck pain and headache, then how can we develop an informed consent and say the person has this risk or that risk relative to chiropractic care and the development of this dissection? I get that, and I understand that. But what I also understand is that in the popular press, on Google, throughout the literature, there is an association, whether it's a temporal association, whether it's a statistical association, there is an association between chiropractic care and vertebral artery dissection. There is also an association between medical care and vertebral artery dissection. So that's a given. Now, it's very important that we understand that association is not causation at this point. The most recent literature, 2016, the literature that most pertinent literature that precedes that, Kozloff and Elton in 2015, and all the way back to Cassidy in 2008, do not say there's a causal relationship. In fact, they deny a causal relationship between chiropractic care and vertebral artery dissection. Nonetheless, in the process of informed consent, to err on the side of caution and to discuss this potential association is very important and very useful for the patient to be fully informed and for you as a chiropractor to be honest and straightforward with the patient about this association. This also serves to protect you and has the potential to remove a cause of action from the table if anything unfortunate happens down the road. Important in the process of informed consent is the delivery. Informed consent is not just a slip of paper they sign at the front desk and it's put in the file and that's it. The patient should always have an opportunity to discuss with you any questions or concerns that they might have. Not with the front desk, but with you. To perfect the delivery of your informed consent is very important in the process as a whole. The third step in the process is to make sure your records reflect the informed consent discussion. The documentation was presented to the patient signed it, you discussed it, they didn't have any questions, you sign it, date it, and move on. And then obviously maintain a copy of the informed consent that is signed by the patient in the patient records, and then over time update your informed consent as the literature involves. If you don't know where to go to get a good informed consent statement or information about that, I would refer you back to ChiroSecure. ChiroSecure has developed a very useful informed consent packet that not only provides you with a informed consent statement for your consideration, but also provides you with the background literature in summary form to be able to fully understand and appreciate the nuances of the informed consent and to be able to explain to patients the information. Continuing on the theme of what we can learn from this experience, this is a great opportunity for each and every one of us to review the current and the most timely literature on this subject. And there are three pieces of literature that I'd like to chat with you about this morning. The first is Cassidy from 2008. The second is Kozloff and Elton from 2015. And the third is Church and Associates from 2016. Cassidy was the seminal article establishing the idea that there was no greater risk of vertebral dissection under chiropractic care in comparison to medical care for patients presenting with neck pain and headache. Kozloff was a repeat of essentially the Cassidy model using US data in a much larger pool and came up with even stronger results than Cassidy did. And then finally, Church, that was published in 2016, is very interesting because it comes from a team of neurosurgeons at the Penn State Institute of the Neurosciences, and they conclude that there is no causal relationship between cervical spine adjusting and vertebral artery issues. Now, I'm going to take a step aside from that discussion and just look at some basic numbers so we get a handle on this thing. The natural history of vertebral artery dissection is approximately 1 case per 100,000 population per year. So if we assume in the United States we have a population of 350 million people, and this occurs at a rate of 1 per 100,000, that means on an annual basis in the US, there'll be 3,500 arterial dissection cases. Now, if we make the assumption that we as chiropractors see about 10% of the population, then that means 10% or 3,500 or 350 of these phenomena will likely cross paths with the chiropractor. Now, this assumes a very perfect, even distribution across the population, a perfect distribution among the chiropractic community. We know that's not real. But just as an illustration, let's walk through this with me. Stay with me as I walk through this. So we start out with 3,500 cases in the United States. 10% of the patients see a chiropractor, so 350 of these potentially have a chance to cross paths with a chiropractor. We know from the literature that the fatality rate with arterial dissection is approximately 5%. 5% of 350 is about 17 to 18 cases. So we know that in the natural history of this thing, that 17 to 18 of these cases will cross paths with a chiropractor in a fatality situation whether the chiropractor ever touched them or not. So it's important for us to have that background and that data and look at it. Then when we look at the Cassidy study, then we appreciate the fact that Cassidy found no greater incidence of vertebral artery dissection for persons under chiropractic care in comparison to persons under primary medical care. Kozloff and Elton repeated the same study, the same model, 2015, came out with an even stronger result. I would suggest to you that Cassidy, Kozloff, and Church are three pieces of literature that every chiropractor should have, every chiropractor should have read, and every chiropractor should have virtually dedicated to memory. These are critical to understanding this problem and understanding the context of how it interfaces with the chiropractic world. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of what to do differently in your office, let me review some of the basics that we know should be attended to. First, relative to patient history. When a patient presents with headache and neck pain, don't simply take it as headache and neck pain. Explore it more fully. Figure out how the patient is describing the pain. When they use a phrase, something like or close to, this pain is unlike anything I've ever had in my life, or this is unlike any kind of headache I've ever had before, or this is unlike any kind of neck pain I've ever had before, or it's the worst neck pain I've ever had before, pay very close attention to that. You know in your offices on Monday morning that you'll have patients that'll come in and say, oh, doc, I had one of my headaches over the weekend, I need an adjustment. They know their pain, they know their headaches, they know their routine. But when they come in and talk about it being unlike anything they've ever had before, they don't routinely dissect their arteries. And when they do dissect an artery, it produces a very unique pain that they very rarely experience. And when they come in and tell you about that unique pain, pay very close attention to that. The second category of information we want to keep an eye on is there a family history of aneurysm or dissection in this patient's immediate family? If there is, there's a 5% likelihood that that person may be moving in the direction of aneurysm or dissection themselves. The third area is there is a group of patients and a group of conditions that are collagen disorders that lend themselves to dissection phenomena. For example, Marfan's disease. Marfan's disease is most commonly associated with dissection of the abdominal aorta, but again, collagen disorder resulting in dissection. Can be the vertebrals as much as the aorta. Osteogenesis imperfecta increases the fragility, imperfecta 1, increases the fragility in arteries. Ehlers-Danlos syndrome 3 and 6, same thing. Fibromuscular degeneration also increases the fragility. Fibromuscular degeneration, for example, has a tendency to appear more in the renal arteries than the vertebral arteries, but it sets the stage for dissection in any artery of the body. And then also we want to pay attention to clotting disorders. Patients with clotting disorders that have hypercoagulable states, that have a far greater risk of coagulation than the normal population, obviously they form thrombi and emboli easier and faster than the regular population, and we need to be alert to those kinds of cases. So in the history, explore the pain, explore the family history, explore the presence of the collagen disorders that I talked about in that individual and in their immediate family. Next slide, please. Relative to physical examination, we were all taught George's test in school, and I may have taught hundreds, if not thousands of you, the use of that test along the way. The bottom line is the test has too many false positives, too many false negatives, and it really isn't worth the time to do. Now, what I would suggest you do is take the opportunity to listen for bruits at the base of the neck. If you hear a bruit, consider a referral immediately. If you don't hear a bruit, that's good, but it doesn't mean everything's free and clear. Continue to look what's going on. When you're looking, and be on the lookout for neurological changes that are associated, just neurological changes in general, number one, and then number two, neurological changes with cervical motion, whether that's active motion or passive motion. You want to look for changes that develop in the process of motion, as the patient lifts their head up, as they tuck their chin down, rotate side to side, etc. Any type of changes. What are you going to look for? You want to look for the 5 Ds, the 3 Ns, and the A. Dizziness, diplopia, dysphagia, dysarthria, drop attacks, nausea, numbness, nystagmus, and ataxia. Now, let's be honest. if we take every person that sees a chiropractor because they have a degree of dizziness, that's a 30-year practice that's out, and we'd be, filling every MRA facility in the country 10 times over. That's not what I'm talking about. When you think about things like dizziness, or you're thinking about things like nausea or numbness, they're less of a concern, but we want to think about how they cluster. When patients do present with double vision, difficulty swallowing, or difficulty speaking, those are major stroke signs, and we want to pay very close attention to that. Also, nystagmus is one that we want to move up the scale of index of suspicion, that when a patient presents with nystagmus and they haven't before, we want to be alert to that. So I'd ask you to be aware of all 9 of these symptom categories. Some are relatively urgent, and others not so, but think about the constellation and the development of the pattern that these symptoms represent. You might also think about these symptoms in relationship to the typical whiplash injury that you see. It's not uncommon for that patient to be dizzy, for them to have double vision, for them to have nausea, for them to have numbness. So keep in mind that there's always the potential that whiplash injury could have caused a dissection in progress as well. And it may be subclinical, but we want to keep that possibility in mind and evaluate for that along the way. Next slide, please. Now, if you have any concern about any of the findings from your history or your physical, take the time to do a quick cranial nerve assessment. Take the time to do the deep tendon reflexes and the dermatome check. It's very good baseline information from a neurological perspective for you to have in your record. If you think there's a possibility of concern for a dissection, a particular dissection in progress, then you want to evaluate how serious you think this is. Is this something that can wait and see a neurologist, or is this something based on the presentation of the patient they need to see an emergency room? That's a call you have to make on each individual situation, and hopefully they're very rare situations, but have it in the back of your mind, be prepared to make that decision. I've never seen a patient that was referred out that was angry because somebody double-checked before moving on with their care. The opposite can be a problem. Next slide, please. Another suggestion in terms of things to do differently in your office. Review your office procedures. Do you have procedures established in your office, written down, and reviewed with your staff for handling emergencies? Now, emergencies don't have to be a stroke. Emergency can be somebody tripping on the doorstep as they walk in and breaking a leg. Having an emergency procedure process and information in your office says you're prepared, you've thought about this, you're taking the right steps, and you're doing the right thing. Having your emergency contact information at your fingertips is just simply good procedure and good practice. And then ultimately document, and document. I had a question in a presentation similar to this that I made not too long ago, and a person asked, well, how do we fare in court when these things come up? And I said, we fare pretty good. I said, but the problem invariably isn't how the patient is or what the chiropractor did. It's the documentation the chiropractor provides the attorneys to represent them. And invariably, that documentation is weak. And the weaker it is, the more vulnerable the chiropractor is, simply because the background information that's needed to defend them isn't in the record. And if it's not there, it didn't happen, it didn't exist. So take a look at your records, think about how much you're documenting, think about how clear they are, and think about the exam procedures you're using, and beef them up a little bit. Next slide, please. Now, there's another perspective on this that I'd like to chat about for a little bit, and that's our reaction as chiropractors in putting this thing in context. And I know some of you have been thinking in the back of your mind since this entire presentation started, listen, I know for a fact that 3 people per hour every day of every week of every month of every year are dying in the United States from opiate use and abuse. We know for a fact that thousands died of surgical complications, surgical errors, and preventable complications in hospitals. We know that medical care is considered to be the 3rd leading cause of death in the United States. This is not a surprise. People know this stuff. We know it. Next slide, please. Now, as I continue this discussion, I want to be very clear. I am not dismissing or discounting any death, certainly not the death of Katie May. But what I am asking is why the unfortunate passing of one patient, possibly, not definitively, not confirmed, but possibly as a complication of chiropractic care, why does that become national news? Now, I can't answer that definitively. I have my thoughts on it. I'm sure you have your thoughts on it. But at this moment, whether we think it's unfair, whether we think the reaction of the press has been disproportionate, whether we think people are picking on us, however that is, it doesn't matter. The bottom line, it is the way it is. And we need to turn our attention back to putting the patient first, putting the patient second, and putting the patient always in the focus of our attention as we're going about our practice. Our concern about how we're dealt with by the press in this thing is secondary to the patient's needs. Now, I agree the way we've been handled in some of this is unfair. The bottom line is we can't change that on a national level. What you can change is how you respond to it in your office. There's no need to be defensive. The facts support where we are. This is a very unfortunate situation. In the fullness of time, whether it's determined to be related to chiropractic care or not, it doesn't matter. We want the public to know that we're aware of this, we're attending to it, and that in the scheme of things, relative to neck pain and headache, chiropractic is the safest intervention across the spectrum of things to be done to people when you look at medications, when you look at surgery, when you look at other interventions. Nothing comes close to the safety of chiropractic care. So we need to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Now, another caution that I would have for you, and this may sound a little preachy to you, and I apologize if it does, but you may feel a need at this moment to set the record straight. And you may feel like that you as a chiropractor have been unfairly judged, and the chiropractic profession has been unfairly judged. And you may be approached by a local, state, or national news media for a comment. I'm pleading with you, resist the desire to accept the offer. Refer those inquiries to your state and national associations, and you go back into your office and continue to take great care of your patients. The bottom line is this is not the issue nor the time to cut your teeth as a spokesperson for the profession. If you haven't had tremendous background experience and training and media training, and you're not intimately familiar with the literature of the situation, please do not enter this fray. It's a very critical moment, and we need to make sure that the answers that the press gets are informed, are logical, are reasonable, and are knowledgeable, and they're supported by the literature. Next slide, please. In contrast, it might be helpful to you to read what some folks are saying, particularly some high-profile folks in medicine are saying about this situation. Early on in this discussion, I made reference to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, as Dr. Hoffman did, and the director of the Penn State Institute of the Neurosciences was quoted in the article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And his perspective was very simply, the chiropractor got caught in the middle. And he went on to say that it was unlikely to have caused the original tear. And then as he was quoted as saying specifically, I think the data is overwhelming that there's a very low risk of dissection from neck manipulation. Next slide, please. In that same article, there was a quote from Felipe Albuquerque, a neurologist in Phoenix, who has published in this area. In January 2011, in the Journal of Neurosurgery, he published an article critical of chiropractic care relative to dissection and so on. And even he had the perspective that Ms. May was, quote, she probably injured her artery during the modeling pose. He went on to say it was his perspective that he thought the chiropractor worsened the situation, but the problem didn't begin with the chiropractor. It was complicated under chiropractic care in his view. The next slide, please. And then finally, as reported in People Bodies, an online presentation of People magazine, Jeff Wang, the co-director of the University of Southern California Spine Center, characterized the entire matter as a freak accident. The People Bodies report is interesting because it's one of the few presentations and articles about this that quoted the chiropractor first and the neurologist at the tail end. Dan Murphy was featured in this presentation on the 21st and did a great job representing the profession, as he always does. Next slide, please. So where are we? Well, bottom line is we know better than anybody else the significance of patients, of the care that patients receive from us. We appreciate the value of cervical spine adjusting in particular, and we know how gentle adjustments can be. We know how bizarre it is to think of someone saying that a cervical adjustment rises to the level of being blunt force trauma, as the coroner was quoted as having noted. That's nonsensical if you understand how adjustments are delivered. You also know how hard you work to make sure your adjustments are delivered with great skill and great efficacy. And we know that millions of adjustments are provided daily and that the safety of chiropractic care is stellar. And ultimately, we know that our job is to protect our patients, to act in their best interest every time and in every way. And if we do that, we'll be well served, they will be well served, and the future of the profession will be well served. Next slide, please. I want to thank you for your time and attention today. Thank you for being diligent and thorough in your care of your patients. And thank you for taking the time today to brush up on the details of this situation, to learn what we can, change our procedures as best we can, even safer, more competent, and more capable tomorrow and every day to follow. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been my pleasure.